Welcome to Dollar Gujarati, a show about successful Gujarati entrepreneurs and professionals in America. We talk with them about their ideas and struggles on the road to success in this land of opportunity. As immigrants ourselves, we want to understand the different paths that successful immigrant Gujaratis have taken to establish themselves. This will also help us to navigate our journey in America. Hello, listeners. Today we have as our guest Shruti Gandhi. Shruti is the founder and managing partner of Array Ventures, a venture capital firm that invests in AI startups in the enterprise space. Shruti is what we would call a unicorn. She is both an engineer and a businesswoman. With a master's in computer science engineering from Columbia University and an MBA from Booth School of Business in Chicago, we have Shruti's perspective on what is it like to be an engineer and an MBA. Thank you, Shruti, for coming on our show. We're looking forward to have a very good conversation about engineering and business skills. Before we started recording the episode, you said you started out picking up these skills because you wanted to be an entrepreneur. Where did this initial thought or this idea of wanting to become an entrepreneur come out? Is it
I mean, come
because
on,
you
you're
were
asking a Gujarati. Why do you want to run a business? It's very simple. My journey has always been based on what I'm curious about. I always knew I wanted to start a company, so I needed to get the skills to get there. Because we're all on a Gujarati podcast, so we're dando. My dad runs a business in India. So when I came to the US, I spent my first decade building the engineering skills to build out a business. When I started the business, I realized that my background was more in the traditional dando sense, what we learn about. But venture-backed businesses are different. Fundraising is different, things we don't know about in that context. So with that, I decided to spend my next learning into learning about venture-backed businesses. Um, that is why I went to business school at U Chicago. I thought that it was a good way to kind of build some network and foundations around that. That did help. I went from there on to venture capital at Samsung, and then another firm called True Ventures, which is one of the top tier firms in Silicon Valley. And then I went from there on to actually start a company. Long story short, that company ended up becoming my fund. So in a way, I'm now funding many businesses that I'm filling out my entrepreneurial dreams in many ways. One is starting my own fund, and then two, fueling and funding a lot of amazing, passionate founders who want to build their own businesses. So enabling them. So that's how I connect the dots. It's always about like learning and figuring out how to reverse engineer what I want to get to.
okay. Let's take a step back for a moment and talk about your education. You went to Columbia University, which is a great Ivy League college for computer engineering. But Ivy League, while they are amazing colleges, they're also very expensive. How did you, I mean, coming from a Gujarati family, ROI is always at the back of our mind. So how did you go through college paying for tuition?
It's a very good question. So I went there for my master's, right? So my undergrad is at a small school upstate New York um, called Marist College. So I'll tell you exactly how I funded all my degrees. During undergrad, I actually did not have admission in a college period. When we came here, my parents didn't know that we should be giving SATs and things, right? So I came here and then I was like, we're going to start college. And long story short, that was not how easy it was going to be. I actually started working at the computing lab at Marist College without even getting admitted there. So, and I knew that again, reverse engineering, that job, I taught myself how to code. Like at that time, it was, I didn't even know how to type. So I started taking these like typing lessons on my cousin's laptop, not laptop, computer, old school computer. And then I went from there and I taught myself how to teach like HTML and JavaScript and things like that. So then I went and worked at the computing lab. And then the computing lab was over the summer, starting from April or May, I think around at that time when I got in 99 here. School was starting in September. So I worked there for a couple months. But then I kept calling the admissions and other folks saying I want to get into the university without SATs. And so that's how I got into college. Um, Long story short, they ended up giving me a bunch of credits, and I actually ended up graduating in like 2.5 years instead of 4 years because of all the other stuff I did. And yeah, and then I actually continued to work there in the computing lab, and then I got to work at IBM, which is also in the same town. So what the story of how I ended up at IBM was the clients I had in the computing lab were professors at Marist who were also managers at IBM. And they said, "Oh, we like working with you. You should work at apply for an internship at IBM." And so funny thing is, like, I ended up actually working full time, basically as co-op or whatever at IBM during undergrad, and then I ended up paying for everything for my college and everything based on these jobs I had. Long story short, Columbia was then I made basically IBM paid for that.
Oh,
And
okay.
I worked full time again. So I've always worked full time throughout all my degrees, um, full time or at least kind of full time. So then even for masters at Columbia, they paid for it. It came with an attachment of like then I would have to stay with IBM for a while, which I didn't mind, and that's why I ended up being at IBM for about a decade, from throughout undergrad till later. And then for my business school at U Chicago Booth, same thing. IBM paid for some part of it, even though I wasn't working there full time. But then I actually at that time started my company, and also at that time, the second half of the year, I ended up working at a few venture funds that also paid for me. So I ended up paying for the college that way too. So I've always kind of believed that education is great, but practical education, which is working at places, is even better, which is what I was telling you about, that you should
Yeah.
try to find these opportunities that kind of really matter, because education is fine in the sense of like it fulfills your ego and gives you this pride degree. Um, but I don't even know. I think I've moved so many times. I have no idea where my paper degrees are, frankly. So it doesn't matter.
Okay. You've spoken a little bit about reverse engineering stuff. I think that's your way of working through things, and I think it's a great way. And that's how you learned coding, and that's how you learned how to fund your college education. And you also spoke about how venture capitalists are pattern matchers, and they were funding a certain type of founder and a certain type of startup, but they were not funding your company. So what was the result of your reverse engineering that piece?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, so the Silicon Valley pattern, for good or bad, like is uh, funding a good engineer out of a good lab at Stanford with a good professor. And even if you don't figure out revenue right away, they get funded, because oftentimes they get funded, I should say, because the bet is on the founders and the ability for them to just figure it out. But I didn't have that kind of a pattern. I did not go to Stanford uh, or a school that VCs are used to backing out of. Even though I went to some of the top schools, that's not enough. They're not known for their entrepreneurial success. So that is the pattern I wanted to fit in the pattern somehow. And for me, it would be to, you know, uh, raising money and understanding how venture-backed businesses work was something I wanted to solve for, because I thought that similar founders and similar founders that were solving similar problems were getting funded more than I was, and I kind of wanted to figure out why that was the case. So I went from there into venture, and to decide and to figure out how venture-backed businesses work. So the next time I went to go start a company, it wouldn't, I shouldn't have had a hard time raising money. So I wanted to build out the network. I wanted to understand the principles of venture-backed businesses, growth, scaling, all the things that that you need to understand before you build a venture-backed business. So that's what I learned. And then I was leaving to start a company, which ended up becoming my fund. So that was kind of like another entrepreneurial journey, but a little different. I frankly, I think that there were so many things that were off, right? Like one of the biggest thing that I actually help our founders at Array think about is the biggest thing missing is thinking about how you're going to make that money, right? And from day one, you have to think about how do you start from nothing, get to 1 million in revenue, recurring revenue, which is what we focus on, then from million to 10, 10 to 50, 50 to 100, and how fast. So that was missing in from my own story. Because what happens is most people start things out of passion, but they forget how passion translates into revenue. And you can do that. You can think about that and say, we'll figure it out later. But most founders who don't get to that thinking early on end up not finding that journey. If you find it accidentally, that's great. A lot of people have figured that out.
Last week, Keval spoke to us about what his investment thesis was. So he says he looks for three things in any investment. The first is how big is the market? The second is the founder and how that founder is suited for that market. And the third is a sufficiently good answer for why now. Do you concur with his thesis or do you have a different way of approaching things?
Yeah, I concur with whatever he's saying, except we add one more thing. It's like, what is your background to be able to build this? I think Cable and I fund a little different type of business. I fund uh, more enterprise B2B businesses as well. And he backs them as well, but he also is a little bit more on consumer side too. Um, so for us, when I back someone, I want to know if they can build that data machine learning company, and how fast they can build it. I think um, a lot of people have great ideas, but execution ends up being a problem. And I don't like funding founders that don't know how to build their own products, especially because of the kinds of things we like to fund. Because if you're hiring an outsourcing shop or something, it just does not fit the requirements of what we are trying to back.
Okay. Um,
So, you're looking for founders who have the technical capabilities to, or at least know, even if they're not masters in it, but you're looking for someone who at least
Or they
has.
have a good network of people they can hire to build,
Okay,
instead of, right, like either you know how to build it or you are so stellar that everyone wants to work with you, so you can hire them ASAP. um, Having to go hire outsourcing shops is not what we want to fund.
got you.
yeah, I've seen that a lot of startups, just for the sake of doing startups, the founders, they're not really technical, but then they outsource the initial MVP also to these outsourcing shops. Has that ever worked?
um I have seen some examples of that, but in a very different industry like health, where
Okay.
I felt that the founders were top. Like usually I don't say MBAs should do this, but like I think the founders were top um, experts in, like, from McKinsey and such, and they had insights into the health market, and they were very smart. I think that, and so they decided to find, I don't know if it was outsourcing shop per se, but like they didn't have the technical talent. That was one example. The other one, I think, like companies like Rent the Runway and others might have been an example of that as well, but I don't actually fully know. Look, I'm not saying smart people can't do great things, but but it's for us, it's the kind of businesses we're building. They're not just workflow, and they're full on, AI, machine learning, computer vision, things that are hard to build. And I don't know that many good outsourcing shops that you can get to kind of get that going. And if you do, like, I don't know, like maybe I should fund the outsourcing shop and not the founders, right? Like, yeah.
Okay. So how do you go about finding such founders and such startups?
Yeah, I think that's another thing people talk about, like network. Your own network matters. Because we've had success and a good brand, that is a good way for founders to find you through a lot of ways. We also end up working with a lot of other funds, but the thing we're in the middle of building out is like an angel network. We do these collective events where we bring a lot of angels together on a particular topic, and that's how we through those networks we end up finding a lot of our deals.
Okay. As a Gujarati, something's always there at the back of my mind. How am I going to make money with whatever I'm going to do? It's the same for us with Dollar Gujarati. We haven't been able to find a good enough answer yet, but it's there at the back of our minds. Uh, how does a VC firm like Array VC make money, make profits?
That's a good question. Venture funds have a model of you get paid when you make money for the fund. So the typical structure is this 20% minimum carry per se, where if you return the principal amount, let's say, that's like the terminology to use from other contexts. The fund is $100 million, and if you return $100 million, then anything beyond that, 20% is yours. Take.
Okay.
So you are driven to make money from that perspective, because if you don't return the 100 million,
You
then
won't get paid.
you won't get paid. So people think venture business is about making a lot of money. It actually isn't. Until 7 to 10 years from now, you return the fund and then you get the carry. So in some ways, venture business is for someone who's really passionate about the space, and wanting to work with founders. But if you want to make money, you should go do something else. Yeah, I was just talking to a very top-notch lawyer who was a lawyer for all the top tech companies you might have heard of in the 2000s, like Twitter and Facebook and so forth. And he's now VC in his late 50s. And he was like, oh, I don't make money now. I could make more money if I went as a lawyer. So yeah, I think venture, it's a good question. So if you want to make money, you just have to work hard into getting into some of the best deals and have strong conviction as to why those deals will actually help you return the fund.
So what advice would you give to someone like Atit, Jaini, or me to spend the next 6 months to a year? Uh, like the coronavirus is there. The world is kind of at a standstill. What's the best use of our free time if we want to be an entrepreneur?
Learn how to market well. I think that's a good start, the podcast, but learn and observe how people work on Twitter, create content. Most people won't read anything you write unless unless you have a following. And so initially, right now, you can make mistakes, and then when you figure it out, you'll have an audience, and that's the most important thing. And you can be initially I was very afraid putting anything out there, but I don't even know what I put out there anymore, and it doesn't matter. The same concept as what I learned at Pensive. Like, just create enough that most people don't even find all your bad stuff.
Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot, Shruti.
Awesome.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Say
Say
hi
hi
to
to Lily
Lily.
from us.
Yeah, I know she's ready to pounce. I need some dhokra.
Thanks for listening to the show this week. And if you want to ask us any questions or want to see someone specific on our show, write to us at dollargujarati@gmail.com. You can also tweet to us at dollargujarati. Make sure you don't miss any episode by subscribing to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or however it is that you get your podcast. I'm Dakshaday Shah, and you've been listening to Dollar Gujarati.